Hard-Eye, the house on Maple Street. I'm typing this from a small, rental bungalow 3 hours away from the city where I spent the first 38 years of my life. Outside, the rain is hammering against the tin roof of the porch, and for the first time in 3 years, my mind isn't spinning. My name is Arthur. Up until 18 months ago, I was a senior partner at a mid-sized structural engineering firm in Chicago. I had a 4-bedroom colonial house in a quiet, tree-lined suburb, a 2-car garage, a retirement portfolio that was ahead of schedule, and what I genuinely believed was an ironclad, unshakable support system. My inner circle was small, intentionally so. It consisted of my wife of 11 years, Clara, and my younger brother, Julian. When our parents died in a highway accident during my final year of college, Julian was only 14. I was 22. Overnight, I went from a young guy worrying about finals and entry-level engineering salaries to a surrogate father responsible for a traumatized teenager. I took out additional student loans to keep our childhood home long enough for Julian to finish high school. I made sure he had fresh clothes, nutritious meals, a tutor when his math grades dropped, and a car when he turned 16. I put my own life, dating, and early career ambitions on the back burner for nearly a decade to make sure Julian had a foundation. When Julian decided he wanted to go into commercial real estate, I paid his tuition at an out-of-state university out of my own pocket, so he wouldn't carry the weight of debt that I had carried. When he moved back to the city after graduation, I helped him secure his first apartment, put down the security deposit, and introduced him to every client and developer in my professional network. Clara came into my life when I was 30. She was a landscape architect, bright, creative, with a quiet intensity that balanced my methodical, numbers-driven brain. When we got married 3 years later, Julian was my best man. In his toast, he stood up in front of 100 people, raised a glass of champagne, and wept. He called me his hero, the man who had pulled him from the rubble of our parents' death and built a life for both of us. He vowed that he would spend the rest of his life making sure he made me proud. For 8 years, our lives felt seamless. Julian built a career as an independent commercial property broker. Clara's design firm took off. My engineering firm flourished. Julian spent almost every Sunday at our house. He had his own room in the basement that we'd converted into a guest suite. He had a key to the front door, his own setting at the dinner table, and an open invitation to come and go whenever he wanted. He was more than my brother. He was my finest life achievement. Then came the Northridge Industrial Project. In the autumn of 3 years ago, a massive municipal development deal opened up on the city's west side. The city was redeveloping an 80-acre abandoned rail yard into a high-density mixed-use commercial center called the Northridge District. The contract for the primary structural evaluation, foundation design, and site safety management was worth millions. More importantly, it was the kind of legacy project that elevated a firm into a completely different tier. My engineering firm, Vance and Associates, decided to throw everything behind bidding for the contract. At the same time, Julian approached me with an idea. He had recently formed a boutique real estate brokerage and investment group called Apex Municipal Ventures. "Artie," Julian said to me one Sunday evening over a beer on my back patio, "this is our shot. If Apex lands the exclusive site acquisition contract for Northridge, and Vance and Associates lands the structural engineering side, we own this city's biggest project. We can work together, pool our intelligence, and finally build something that belongs to us." I looked at my little brother, proud of his ambition. "Julian, it's a huge undertaking. The city's ethics guidelines on municipal bids are ironclad. There can't be any appearance of insider trading or conflict of interest between the brokerage and the engineering inspectors. Everything will be completely above board," Julian assured me, his eyes gleaming with enthusiasm. Separate legal entities, independent firewalls, but we can share high-level industry insights. We keep each other informed. We win together. I agreed. I convinced my senior partners at Vance and Associates to subcontract certain preliminary site survey evaluations through Julian's firm. I put my reputation on the line to vouch for him with our board. Around the same time, Clara began working on a massive private estate redesign 40 miles outside the city. Her job required her to be on site 3 to 4 days a week, often staying overnight at a nearby hotel to manage sunrise concrete pours and nursery deliveries. Because I was spending 80 hours a week buried in blueprints, soil composition reports, and municipal compliance filings for the Northridge bid, I was rarely home before 10:00 p.m. I was exhausted, living on cold coffee and takeout, but I was pushed by the thought that I was securing our family's future for the next 20 years. I noticed the subtle shifts, but I rationalized every single one of them. First, it was Julian's presence at the house when I wasn't there. I'd come home late on a Tuesday night, expecting an empty house, only to find Julian's sedan parked in the driveway. I'd walk inside, and he'd be sitting at the kitchen island, drinking wine with Clara. "Hey, Artie," Julian would say with his signature easy smile. Clara was stressed about the drainage specs for her estate project, so I dropped off some municipal survey maps to help her out. Brought dinner, too. "Thanks, Jules," I'd say, kissing Clara's cheek and slumping into a chair. "I appreciate you taking care of her while I'm trapped at the office." "That's what family is for, brother," he'd answer, clapping my shoulder. Then Clara started changing. The warm, attentive partner I had known for a decade became increasingly distant, hypercritical, and protective of her personal schedule. She changed the passcode on her laptop and phone, citing strict non-disclosure agreements for her high-net-worth estate clients. She stopped asking about the Northridge project. When I tried to talk to her about my stress, she'd listen with a flat, detached look on her face before changing the subject to how much time I spent working. "You're never present, Arthur," she told me one morning as I was rushing out the door. "Even when you're sitting on the couch, your mind is somewhere in a spreadsheet." "Clara, it's 6 more months," I pleaded, holding her hands. "Once the Northridge contract is awarded and the initial foundation phases are set, I can hire 2 junior project managers and delegate the fieldwork. We can take that 3-week trip to Italy we've been planning for 5 years. She pulled her hands away gently. 6 months always turns into another project, Arthur. I felt guilty. I genuinely believed I was failing her as a husband. To compensate, I transferred an additional $50,000 from my personal investment portfolio into our joint checking account, telling her to hire extra staff for her firm or take a luxury spa trip with her friends to relax. She took the money without a word. By spring, the pressure on the Northridge bid reached its peak. Vance and Associates was one of 2 final firms being considered by the Municipal Development Board. Our primary competitor was a massive, national infrastructure conglomerate called Titan Infrastructure Group. Titan was infamous for aggressive, cutthroat tactics, but our local expertise and spotless safety record gave us a slight edge. 2 weeks before the final sealed bids were due to the city council, a devastating glitch hit our internal systems. Part II, the fracture. It was a Thursday afternoon. I was sitting in my corner office at Vance and Associates, reviewing the finalized cost estimation tables for our bid. The structural safety margins on the Northridge site were extremely delicate due to the old railway soil contamination and high water table. Our proposal called for deep foundation micropiling, an expensive technique, but the only legal and structurally sound way to ensure the long-term stability of the buildings. My senior project manager, a sharp young engineer named Sarah, walked into my office, her face pale. Arthur, we have a major anomaly in the server access logs, Sarah said, closing the door behind her. What kind of anomaly? I asked without looking up from my monitor. Someone accessed the secure folder containing our proprietary Northridge micropiling cost structures and soil engineering assessments at 2:00 a.m. last night, she said. They downloaded the entire raw data set onto an external drive. I paused, my pen hovering over the paper. Was it an internal IP, one of our senior engineers working late? That's the strange part, Sarah said, dropping a printed log onto my desk. The login credentials used belong to your administrator profile, but the IP address wasn't from your home network, and it wasn't from the office. It was executed remotely via an authorized remote desktop gateway. My heart gave a faint, uncomfortable flutter, but I quickly suppressed the panic. I had given my remote access key to 2 people outside the core engineering team, my legal counsel, and my brother Julian, so that his firm could cross-reference our environmental compliance data for the municipal board. It was probably Julian's team verifying the environmental clearance annexes, I said, trying to convince myself more than Sarah. He has full clearance for the joint municipal presentation. Arthur, Sarah said cautiously, her voice lowering. Titan Infrastructure lowered their bid estimate yesterday afternoon by 3%. Their new submission specifically undercuts our foundation cost model by claiming micropiling is unnecessary and proposing standard concrete caissons instead. They used structural language that is almost word-for-word identical to the internal risk analysis notes you wrote last week. The air in the room suddenly felt thin. I looked at the log. The timestamp was 2:14 a.m. That night, I had been fast asleep at home. I remembered waking up around 3:00 a.m. to grab a glass of water, and Clara hadn't been in bed. When I walked down the hall, I had seen her in her home office, her laptop screen illuminating her face in the dark. When I asked her what she was doing, she had quickly slammed the laptop shut and said she was dealing with an urgent email from her nursery supplier. A cold, sick knot began to form in the pit of my stomach. I told Sarah to keep the anomaly quiet, locked my office, and drove home early. When I pulled up to our house at 4:00 p.m., Julian's car was in the driveway. I parked down the street, stepping out quietly into the afternoon drizzle. Instead of walking up the front steps, I walked along the side of the house, through the gate, and into the backyard. The French doors leading from the back patio into my home office were unlocked, left cracked open an inch to let in the cool spring breeze. I stood under the overhang of the porch, shielded by the overgrown boxwood hedges. Inside my office, voices were carrying clearly over the sound of the rain. He doesn't suspect a thing, Julian's voice said. It was smooth, confident, and completely stripped of the warmth he used when speaking to me. He thinks Titan just got lucky with their cost modeling. The guy is so buried in his calculations he can't see what's right in front of him. Julian, are you absolute sure Titan is going to honor the consultant payout? Clara's voice sounded tense, but there was no fear in it. No hesitation. Titan's regional VP signed the agreement yesterday, Julian replied with a short, dismissive laugh. Once Vance and Associates loses the Northridge bid, Titan takes over the master contract. They've guaranteed Apex a 7% finder's fee and the exclusive broker rights for the entire commercial parcel. That's a $3 million commission, Clara. $3 million. A long silence followed. I stood frozen in the rain, my breath hitching in my chest, my hands trembling violently against the cold, damp wood of the house frame. What about Arthur's firm? Clara asked softly. If Vance loses Northridge, the board is going to hold him personally responsible for the failure. They put up millions in prep capital. Vance and Associates is finished anyway, Julian said callously. Their overhead is too high because Arthur refuses to take standard commercial shortcuts. He's obsolete, Clara. He's lived his whole life playing by the rules, thinking hard work and integrity actually mean something in this town. Once the Northridge deal collapses on him, he'll be buried in debt, his partners will turn on him, and he'll spend the next 5 years in litigation. In the house, Clara asked. We file the divorce paperwork 48 hours after the city council announces Titan as the winning bidder, Julian said calmly. We push for an expedited court division based on his business liabilities. You take 50% of the residential liquid equity, walk away from his firm's debts, and we transfer the Apex Commission funds to the offshore holding structure in Nevis we set up last month. By winter, we're living in Miami, and Artie can figure out how to rebuild his life from scratch. Then I heard the sound of footsteps, followed by the quiet rustle of clothing and the undeniable, agonizing sound of my wife kissing my younger brother. He truly believes you love him, you know, Clara whispered with a quiet laugh. He told me last week that raised you like a son. Artie's problem is that he thinks everyone owes him something because he played the martyr, Julian sneered. He raised me because he had to. Now I'm taking what's mine. I didn't crash through the glass doors. I didn't scream. I didn't pull a weapon or charge into the room with flaring fists. When a man's entire reality is demolished in a matter of 60 seconds, the human mind does something extraordinary to protect itself. A deep, freezing numbness descended over my consciousness. My biological impulse to rage was completely bypassed by a cold, calculating hyperlucidity. I realized 3 fundamental truths in that split second. First, if I confronted them right now, they would cover their tracks, delete digital evidence, shift funds, and hide behind expensive lawyers while blaming me for emotional instability. Second, my brother and my wife had not just fallen into an accidental affair. They had spent at least a year planning the systematic, financial, and professional execution of my life. Third, if I wanted to survive, I had to stop being Arthur the big brother, Arthur the forgiving husband, and become something I had never been in my life. Completely, utterly ruthless. I took 5 quiet steps back across the lawn, exited through the side gate, walked back to my truck, and drove away. Part I, the long game. I pulled into the parking lot of a quiet diner 10 miles away, sat in a back booth, and ordered a black coffee. My hands were completely steady, but my skin felt ice cold. I took out a small yellow legal pad I kept in my jacket and wrote 3 names at the top of the page: Julian, Clara, Titan Infrastructure. Underneath, I began mapping out their structure, their assumptions, and their fatal flaws. Julian and Clara's plan relied entirely on 3 assumptions. I was completely ignorant of their financial theft and infidelity. Vance and Associates would lose the Northridge municipal contract to Titan. The stolen engineering data was accurate and viable for Titan's bidding process. That third assumption was where they had made their greatest mistake. What Julian and Clara didn't understand, because neither of them was a structural engineer, was that the data downloaded from my administrator profile contained raw, uncorrected soil core analysis files from the Northridge East Quadrant. 3 weeks earlier, our field teams had discovered a subterranean anomaly, an ancient, unmapped glacial fault line running 40 feet beneath the clay layer. Standard concrete caissons, the cheaper method Titan was planning to use to undercut our bid, would fail structural load testing within 5 years, causing severe foundation settling and catastrophic structural cracking across the central commercial plaza. I had personally calculated the micropiling requirement specifically to bypass that hidden fault line. The corrected calculations, which accounted for the fault line's shear stress, were stored on an offline, air-gapped, encrypted drive in my desk drawer. The file Julian had stolen was the uncorrected baseline draft, a draft that made standard caissons look viable on paper, but was structurally fatal in reality. I stared at the legal pad for 20 minutes. A dark, terrifying smile touched my lips. They wanted to steal my work. They wanted to use my stolen data to defeat me. I was going to let them. Instead of going home to blow up my marriage, I drove straight to the office of a woman named Victoria Vance, no relation to my firm. Victoria was a formidable 70-year-old senior partner at one of the top corporate litigation firms in the state. She was a legend in legal circles, a woman who had spent 40 years dismantling fraudulent corporate structures and destroying white-collar criminals. I laid everything on her conference table: the server access logs, the IP timestamps, my soil engineering reports, and a detailed account of the conversation I had overheard behind my house. Victoria listened, without interrupting, her dark eyes sharp behind her wire-rimmed glasses. When I finished, she folded her hands on the polished mahogany table. "You have a choice, Arthur," Victoria said, her voice like grinding stones. "You can file for divorce tomorrow, report the data breach to the police, and fight a dirty 3-year civil war that will destroy your business, drag your name through the local papers, and leave you with half your assets stolen. Or you can play the long game." "How long?" I asked. 4 months, Victoria replied. "Long enough for Titan to win the municipal contract using your stolen, flawed data. Long enough for Julian to execute his illegal finder's fee agreements. Long enough for Clara to sign her name to every offshore holding account and tax document she thinks you don't know about. We let them build their own scaffold, and when we pull the lever, they don't get out." "What do I have to do?" "You have to be the best actor this city has ever seen," Victoria said firmly. "You go home, you kiss your wife, you buy your brother a drink, you play the tired, defeated, unsuspecting martyr until I tell you it's time to drop the hammer." For the next 4 months, I lived in a living hell. Every single day was an exercise in psychological endurance. I walked into my house every evening, smelled Clara's perfume, and wondered if Julian had been in our bed 3 hours earlier. I sat across the dining table from her, listened to her ask about my day in her soft, fake voice, and replied with a gentle smile. On Sundays, Julian came over. I poured his favorite scotch, clinked glasses with him, and listened to him give me career advice. "You look stressed, Artie," Julian would say, patting my back. "You need to learn to delegate, man. Work isn't everything. Family is what lasts." "You're right, Jules," I answer, swallowing the bile rising in my throat. "I don't know what I'd do without you." Meanwhile, behind the scenes, Victoria and a hired team of private forensic investigators worked with terrifying speed. We hired a private investigator who documented Clara and Julian's movements. They weren't even being careful anymore. They met at mid-tier hotels downtown, dined at obscure restaurants on the outskirts of the city, and spent weekends together at Clara's nursery site visits. The Pi captured hundreds of high-resolution photos, video footage, and hotel registration logs. Simultaneously, a forensic accountant named David began tracing the money. David discovered that Clara had been quietly liquidating small parcels of our joint investment assets over 18 months, moving funds in increments under $10,000 to avoid automatic tax reporting triggers. The money was being funneled into a local shell company called C&J Architectural Design, which was co-owned by Julian. From there, C&J was transferring the capital into an offshore account registered in Nevis, the exact account Julian had mentioned in my office. They had already stolen $240,000 of my personal life savings before the Northridge bid was even finalized. Then came the day of the municipal bid announcement. Part IV, The Trap. The City Development Board held the final contract presentation in the main auditorium of City Hall. The room was packed with press, council members, real estate executives, and engineering teams. I sat at the front table with my senior partners from Vance and Associates. Julian was sitting 3 rows behind us, wearing a sharp gray suit, sitting next to Titan Infrastructure's regional vice president, a man named Marcus Thorne. Clara was sitting in the gallery, watching with a calm, triumphant look in her eyes. The chairman of the municipal board stepped up to the podium. After an extensive 4-month evaluation, the chairman announced into the microphone, the City of Chicago is proud to award the primary development and structural management contract for the Northridge District to Titan Infrastructure Group, based on their innovative, cost-effective foundation engineering model. A wave of applause erupted through the auditorium. Marcus Thorne stood up, grinning broadly, shaking hands with his team. Julian leaned over, gave Thorne an enthusiastic high five, and then turned to look at me, putting on a sympathetic, sad expression. Clara smiled from the gallery. My senior partner, Richard Vance, slumped in his chair beside me, head in his hands. We lost it, Arthur. I don't understand. Their foundation cost model was 40% lower than ours. How did they figure out how to use standard caissons on that soil? I leaned over and placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. Don't worry, Richard. They didn't figure anything out. That evening, Titan held a victory celebration at an upscale steakhouse downtown. Julian and Clara were there, celebrating quietly in a private booth, confident that their master stroke was complete. I went home, poured myself a single glass of bourbon, and called Victoria. It's done, I told her. Titan signed the municipal development agreement an hour ago. The contract is legally binding. They have incorporated the uncorrected soil data into their official construction filing. Excellent, Victoria said calmly. Now we strike. Step 1 began 48 hours later. Because Titan's engineering plan relied on standard caissons, they were legally required to submit their preliminary foundation load assessments to the State Board of Professional Engineers and the Environmental Protection Agency for final ground permit issuance. The moment Titan submitted those documents, I filed a formal, confidential whistleblower report with the State Regulatory Board, the Federal Highway Administration, and the State Attorney General's Fraud Unit. Attached to my report was a comprehensive, ironclad engineering review signed by 3 independent structural engineering experts from major universities. The review demonstrated beyond a shadow of a doubt that Titan's proposed caisson foundation plan was based on flawed, incomplete soil data, and that constructing high-density commercial buildings on that fault line using their design posed an imminent risk of structural collapse and loss of human life. Furthermore, my report included the digital forensic logs proving that the exact flawed data Titan used had been stolen from Vance and Associates, private servers, via Julian's unauthorized IP access. The regulatory response was instantaneous and nuclear. A week later, Titan was issued an immediate, emergency cease and desist order by the State Board. Their municipal contract was frozen pending a federal criminal investigation into corporate espionage, public safety fraud, and structural negligence. Marcus Thorne and Titan's executive board panicked. They faced millions of dollars in liquidated damages, public humiliation, and potential criminal indictments for signing off on unsafe municipal structures. To save themselves, Titan's legal team immediately handed over all internal communications between Thorne and Julian's firm, Apex Municipal Ventures. The communications proved that Julian had sold Vance and Associates proprietary engineering data to Titan for a guaranteed $3 million kickback. claiming he had full legal authorization from his brother to transfer the files. Julian had committed corporate espionage, wire fraud, and grand larceny, and he had signed his own name to every single email. While the state attorney general was assembling the criminal indictment against Julian and Titan, Victoria and I executed step 2, the domestic and financial ambush. Part V, the confrontation. It was a quiet, chilly Tuesday evening. Clara was sitting at the kitchen island, scrolling through property listings on her tablet, no doubt looking at luxury homes in Miami. Julian was over, sitting in his usual chair, pretending to offer me comfort over the loss of the Northridge contract. "It's tough, Artie," Julian said, taking a sip of scotch. "Sometimes the big corporate guys just have more resources. You gave it your best shot. You should consider downsizing the firm, taking it easy for a while." "Yeah," Clara added softly, not looking up from her screen. "You've been burning the candle at both ends, Arthur. Maybe it's time to let things go." I stood up from the dining table, walked over to my briefcase, and pulled out 2 thick blue leather-bound folders. I walked back into the kitchen and dropped the folders onto the quartz counter between them. The heavy sound echoed through the quiet house. Julian looked at the folders, his eyebrows knitting together. "What's this, Artie?" "Open them," I said quietly. My voice was completely flat, stripped of all emotion, cold as deep ocean water. Clara frowned, setting her tablet down, and reached for the folder closest to her. Julian hesitated, then pulled the second folder toward himself. For 60 seconds, the only sound in the kitchen was the rustle of turning pages. Clara's face went through a terrifying transformation. First came confusion, then mild annoyance, then her skin turned a horrific, chalky white. Her hands began to shake so violently that she dropped the papers onto the counter. Inside her folder were high-resolution, time-stamped surveillance photos of her and Julian at hotels, restaurants, and private residences over an 8-month period. Certified bank statements showing every single $10,000 transfer she had made from our joint accounts into C&J Architectural Design. The offshore account registration documents in Nevis bearing her electronic signature. A formal petition for divorce on the grounds of felony fraud, conversion of marital assets, and extreme misconduct. In Julian's folder were the IP access server logs showing his 2:14 a.m. download of the Northridge files. A copy of the federal subpoena issued to Titan Infrastructure, containing his signed kickback agreement. The formal criminal complaint filed with the state attorney General's Fraud and Cybercrime Division. A civil suit seeking $5 million in damages for tortious interference, breach of fiduciary duty, and corporate theft. Julian's breath hitched in his throat. He tried to speak, but his voice came out as a strangled squeak. He looked up at me, his eyes wide with absolute, unadulterated terror. Artie, wait. Listen to me, Julian stammered, standing up so fast his chair scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. This is a massive misunderstanding. Titan set me up. They manipulated the files. Shut up, Julian, I said softly. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Arthur, please. Clara burst into hysterical tears, dropping to her knees on the kitchen floor, reaching out to grab my legs. He forced me into it. He manipulated me. He told me you were going bankrupt and that we were going to lose everything. I was trying to save our money. I stepped back, letting her hands slide uselessly off my jeans. I looked down at her with pure, unadulterated coldness. You spent 2 years sleeping with my brother in my house while I worked 80 hours a week to pay for your lifestyle, I said, looking her in the eye. You stole $240,000 from the man who trusted you with his life. Don't ever speak to me about saving money. Artie, please, we're brothers, Julian sobbed, his composure completely collapsing. He looked like the terrified 14-year-old boy I had taken in 20 years ago, but the boy was long gone, replaced by a greedy, parasitic adult. You raised me. You can't do this to me. I'll go to prison, Artie. I'll lose everything. You didn't think about brotherhood when you sold my firm's work to Titan, I said, looking at him dead in the eye. You didn't think about brotherhood when you sat at my dinner table, drank my whiskey, and planned how to leave me broke and ruined in the street. You told Clara I was obsolete, Julian. You said I played the martyr. Well, now you get to see what happens when the martyr stops playing. At that exact moment, the headlights of 3 cars illuminated the front window. I walked past Julian, pulled open the front door, and stepped aside. Victoria walked up the steps, accompanied by 2 state police investigators and a process server. Julian Vance, the lead investigator asked, stepping into the foyer and pulling a set of steel handcuffs from his belt. You are under arrest for grand larceny, computer crimes, and wire fraud. The scene that followed was pure, chaotic destruction. Julian was cuffed in my hallway, screaming and crying, begging me to call our family lawyer, begging me to save him one last time. Clara was sitting on the kitchen floor, hyperventilating, sobbing uncontrollably as Victoria handed her the divorce petition and an emergency court order freezing all her personal and business bank accounts. I didn't say another word. I stood by the front door, arms crossed, watching silently as my brother was led down the front walkway in handcuffs and put into the back of a police cruiser. I looked at Clara one last time as she sat crushed among the ruins of her greed. You have 2 hours to pack 1 suitcase, I told her quietly. If you are still in this house by midnight, I will have you arrested for criminal trespass. I picked up my jacket, walked out to my truck, and drove away, leaving her alone in the dark. Part VI, the fallout and rebirth. The legal fallout was swift, devastating, and absolute. Because the stolen data involved municipal infrastructure, federal wire systems, and public safety risks, the prosecution showed zero mercy. Julian's legal team tried to negotiate a plea deal, but Victoria and I provided such a mountain of undeniable digital and financial evidence that the prosecutor had no reason to offer leniency. Julian was convicted on 2 counts of federal wire fraud, 1 count of grand larceny, and 1 count of corporate espionage. He was sentenced to 6 years in a state correctional facility and ordered to pay $1.2 million in civil restitution. His real estate broker license was permanently revoked, his firm was liquidated, and his name was blacklisted from the industry forever. During his sentencing hearing, I sat in the gallery. Julian stood before the judge in an orange jumpsuit, his hair shaggy, his face sunken. He turned to look at me one last time, eyes filled with tears, begging silently for a gesture of forgiveness. I stared back at him with an expressionless face, unmoving, until the bailiffs led him through the door. Clara's destruction was equally complete. Under state law regarding marital misconduct, involving deliberate financial fraud and conversion of assets, her claim to my business, our home, and my retirement accounts was entirely shattered. The court ordered the offshore Nevis account seized, and every dollar she had stolen was returned to my personal portfolio. Her landscape architecture clients, learning of her indictment and civil fraud judgments through public court filings, dropped her contracts overnight. Unable to pay her mounting legal fees, she was forced to sell her business assets at auction. Her family, who had known me for over a decade and knew the sacrifice I had made to raise Julian, were disgusted by her actions. Most of them severed contact with her completely. She moved back to a small rural town 2 states over, living in a rented basement apartment, working an entry-level clerk job to pay off her court-ordered legal debts. As for Vance and Associates, the story had a surprising ending. When Titan Infrastructure was disqualified and publicly disgraced by the fraud scandal, the Municipal Development Board reopened the Northridge contract bidding. Because Vance and Associates was the only firm with accurate soil data, a spotless safety record, and an ironclad reputation for structural integrity, the City Council unanimously awarded us the master contract. The project was a massive, historic success. Over 3 years, my team and I oversaw the construction of the entire commercial plaza. Every foundation pillar was driven deep into the earth using our micropiling system, bypassing the fault line, standing solid and secure on deep, unbreakable bedrock. The day the Northridge Center had its grand opening, my partners and I cut the ribbon in front of hundreds of people. I was offered promotions, public awards, and media interviews. But I realized something fundamental during that celebration. The money, the corporate prestige, the high-rise office, and the suburban colonial house were tied to a life that had been infected by betrayal. I didn't want to spend the rest of my years climbing corporate ladders in a city where every street corner reminded me of the people who had tried to destroy me. I sold my equity in Vance and Associates to Sarah, the brilliant young engineer who had first brought the server anomaly to my attention. She runs the firm now, with total integrity and skill. I took my capital, bought this modest bungalow near the coast, and opened a small, independent structural consulting practice. I work on projects I care about, restoring old historical bridges, inspecting community buildings, and teaching young engineering students at a local college. It's been 18 months since I moved here. Sometimes, late at night, when the rain hits the roof like it's doing right now, I sit on my front porch with a glass of whiskey and look out at the quiet road. I think about the brother I raised, the wife I loved, and the deep, dark pit they tried to dig for me. They thought I was weak because I was kind. They thought I was foolish because I trusted them. They mistook my loyalty for blindness and my patience for helplessness. They tried to tear my life down to the ground, but they forgot the most basic law of structural engineering. When you build a life on honesty, hard work, and unyielding discipline, you aren't building on sand. You're building on bedrock, and no matter how hard the storm blows, no matter who tries to undermine the structure, the foundation holds.